30,000 gallons of gasoline, just like you asked. I'm gonna unhitch the pod.
Hello everyone. In this build I'm making Furiosa's arm from the excellent movie Mad Max Fury Road. This prop is really complex, and to be honest there's not a lot of references out there on the web about it. So I had to go through the entire movie to get as many angle shots as I could of the arm itself. This was probably the most elaborate object I ever tried to make. And to me, the only way to do it justice was to make it out of metal. To do so, along with all the parts I was going to make, I was of course going to need a bunch of rusty old tools. Where exactly to start with a prop like this one? Well, I decided to start with the core and slowly make my way from there. As you will probably notice during the video, I mostly work with aluminum. It's light, easy to work with, but most of all, my shop is simply not equipped to deal with real steel. Once I was done with the core, I made a few sketches to help me understand the mechanism using the references I gathered. The claw is definitely the most recognizable feature of this arm, with its thumb made out of vice grip jaws. And again, nothing's better than the real deal. I used 5 minutes epoxy glue for all the parts I wanted permanently fixed. The index was also made of a solid bar that I shaped with my little belt sander. I used scrap EVA foam to reproduce the rubber details along the finger. Now it was time for the next finger, the one that looks a little bit like a hook. Given the complexity of the arm, my process was pretty much the same for all the mechanical parts. I first made a paper template to test fit everything. I was of course making many versions before it was good enough. Once I was happy with the result, I then transferred that template to the metal to be cut to shape using my metal bandsaw. Seeking for real screws and hardware is always a good idea to increase the realism of your props. The little finger was a bit different. From what I understood from the references, it was made of some sort of leather. So I choose to start with a work glove and build up on top of it. The finger is covered with a small wrench and two other tools that look like screwdrivers. I did not have exactly the same tool in my scrap tool collection, but with some modifications, it will do just fine. More plating was added to the other fingers using the same paper template process that I transferred to the aluminum sheet. I hammered all the pieces on the anvil just to give them a weathered and beaded look. Also, all these imperfections will eventually catch the dirt later on. Perforated steel plates were used to build on 3 of the fingers. As I mentioned earlier, steel is definitely harder to work with. The part took a bit more time to form to shape. These metal sheets really started to make this build look like something. Next, adding an hinge to the thumb was pretty important if I wanted it to be moving like a proper claw. The metal plating that covers the end was extremely hard to reproduce. I have redone the paper template so many times before I made it to a decent result. That was a lot of back and forth. Then again, each piece was cut to shape, sanded, bended, and hammered. As you can see, I use rivets to connect most of these platings to each other. Rivets are fairly cheap and they're easy to use. A real latch was added to mimic the one on the reference, with few modifications. The thumb was then fixed in place so the metal sheets could keep on stacking. Many headaches and rivets later, the plating was pretty much done. Time to tackle the mechanism that would controls the claw. Same old, more paper templates to test fit everything, some machining, some springs, and some nuts and bolts to attach everything together. This claw was surprisingly moving. I had enough with the hand for now, and it was time to move on to the upper part of the arm. The core structure was made of leather with big rivets on top and some extra parts attached to it. This leather was pretty thick, so I used hot water to help me shape it. I use my very limited leather skills to bevel, groove, punch, and stitch this piece to make it look the part. Lucky for me, this prop is supposed to be beat up anyway, so if it looks bad, it's even better. I made a middle stripe that was going to be the core of this part. This stripe would connect the pistons to the end, but it's also the base of many other pieces, like the dial. The dial was built using a brass fitting used for water PEX pipe. Why a PEX connector? Well, I simply went to the hardware store and looked for something that would be a good base for that. I then made a 2D file based on the references and printed out. I glued it in place with basic glue stick and added a needle inside for more realism. A plastic circle was finally put on top of everything for a pretty convincing look. Another attachment was made for the cables. There are 3 pistons on the arm and they all have 2 connectors each. These connectors were a bit tricky to build out of metal with my limited tools, so I decided to build a 3D model and print them out. Some sanding and painting and they were good to go. The upper part was then assembled together with more rivets. An extra piece of leather was cut and shaped to cover the inside. The little ones are never really far in the shop. They always like to look over my work, and I really like to have them around. The rods for the pistons were made of metal pipes from a shoe rack that I never used. They were cut to shape, engraved, and painted to look the part. The main cylinder that I turned on the lathe at the beginning was definitely way too clean, so I hammered it a little bit. The main weathering of this prop was made using aluminum black. This product darkens the metal and gives it a very cool finish. I made sure to remove the excess using a rag to stop the process when I needed to. And I was super pleased with the result. I enhanced the structure and components of the arm by sanding the edges of the pieces. I washed everything with a brown acrylic paint mixed with water to add some color variation in the mix. In one of the reference you can clearly see a tag or a decal of some sort. So again, I made a 2D file of it, printed out, and glued it to the top of the hand. And of course, made sure to blend it with the rest. A key factor in the weathering, but yet subtle, was real rust powder that I made by letting a steel wool in water for a few days. I applied it pretty much everywhere, but mostly in the hollow spot, using a regular brush. It really gave the arm a little additional something by making it more believable. Another recognizable feature of this arm is a twisted wrench mounted on one of the broken piston. And if you're wondering if a pipe wrench could be twisted, hell yeah, but with this. I use different strings of letters to attach the wrench. The last touch was to take care of all the different cables. I first used a yellow rubber tubing to reproduce what looks like a fuel line. Then a computer cable stripped down for the middle one. Finally, a bike brake cable was attached to the mechanism that controls the clock. I know when you watch this you probably think that it was pretty straightforward. But to be honest, and really honest, I almost give up 3 or 4 times easily during that build. I mean really give up. I had to put it aside each time and get back to it few days later with a fresh start. But looking at the result now, I'm sure glad I went all the way and finished it.